Muy buenos días, ahí veo varios nombres
Good
conocidos,
morning.
nombres no
I see many familiar names and not familiar faces because of our virtual setting, but I see many people connected, Caterina Absalon, many other names that I am familiar with
anteriores que he tenido el gusto de
from prior
trabajar con
projects
Colombia.
that we've
Buenos
held
días a todas y todos.
from working with Colombia. Good morning to everyone.
Para poder empezar
I see
esta
Jessica and Harvey are still connecting. Let's wait until they connect so we can begin. Good morning. It's a great pleasure to be connected today with you. Today, welcome to our first round of consultation for the Restoring Hope in Colombia workshop. I am Cassandra Llosa, and I work as a stakeholder engagement analyst at the Nature for Development Global Program at the UNDP based in New York. Yet I am speaking today from Peru in Latin America, as are you. So it's a great pleasure to welcome you and to welcome Liliana Corso. She's a national consultant for our project, and she's an expert in key stakeholders, and she'll be my co-facilitator for this workshop. Liliana, if you could just briefly introduce yourself. Thank you, Cassandra. Welcome, everyone. Good
Mi
morning.
nombre es Liliana
Yes,
Corso, yo también hago parte del
Cassandra,
programa y del
I'm
proyecto
Liliana Corso,
como consultora
and
nacional y para mí también es una alegría poderlos
I
acompañar
am here working at this project, working for this project. Very happy to be here and very happy to be working with restoration. The interpreter apologizes, her audio cut out. Well, thank you so much for participating in our virtual meeting. So before we begin, I just wanted to mention some logistics aspects. Although we are all well versed in these platforms, I wanted to just state that we're going to have simultaneous interpretation into Spanish and English since some of our speakers do not speak Spanish. So we will activate interpretation together. I will do that myself. If you go to the lower part of your screen, there's a globe, a world icon at the bottom, and you can choose on that and select your preferred language. I'm going to speak, I'm going to go to the Spanish channel, for example. Confirm that everything is okay, that you're hearing me. The interpretation is now going into English, but let me know if everything is okay. Thank you, Marian. Marian is listening into the English channel, so she has just given me a thumbs up. Thank you. Okay, so I would also like to recommend
amabilidad de hablar de manera pausada
that you speak in a paused, slower manner, just to
país, como de
facilitate
Verónica, las intérpretes
interpretation,
que nos acompañan el día de
to be
hoy.
able to help Veronica as well, our second interpreter. So thank you so much, and Thais, thank you for your help. My pleasure. If you have a technical issue,
Marigo
send
o al correo
a
electrónico
private
que ella
message to Marion Marigo or
en el
email
chat,
her
en
directly.
lugar de enviarlo en el
And
chat general para no
this is
distraernos.
her email in the general chat. Your microphones will be
Toda la
silenced
sección para poder
throughout this session, and you
claramente,
will be
pero
able to
eso en
hear
la
us
sección de preguntas y
well,
respuestas después de cada una de las presentaciones, ustedes tienen la
clearly.
opción de escribirlas en el chat del Zoom o
Ask
levantar la
your
mano virtualmente.
questions, or you can also raise your virtual
Ha sucedido
hand,
en unos
or
eventos.
you can also turn on your camera and raise your hand, as has occurred in other meetings. We also have a Google Drive folder, and Liliana is going to share that with us in the chat, and you'll be able to access the presentations and the recordings of these sessions held. So we have 77 participants connected. The great
Es un grupo
pleasure to see you all
A mí
connected.
me encantaría poder contar con
It's
una
a
ronda de
very
presentaciones,
big
pero como
group,
sería muy largo,
and it would be wonderful to be able to introduce each other, but holding an introduction round would truly take long. So if you could help me by renaming yourselves in the participants list.
en donde
Now,
dice
if you go into the participants list, there's a click to the mute, next to the mute that says more, and you can change your name there
renombrar, rename yourself.
and rename yourselves. That's the option, rename.
colocar su nombre y, por ejemplo,
And if you could
la
just
institución del
state
que
your
quiere
last
enviar
name
el
and the
nombre
name of
puede
your
ver
first and last name and the name of
UNDP
the
Colombia,
organization.
Corso, UNDP,
So you could
así
see
que
that we're
muchísimas
all
gracias.
identified.
También he visto que ya varios me han ido saludando a todos.
So I see many
Si
people
pueden
have
escribir en el chat,
greeted me,
por ejemplo,
but if you could
Patricia ya nos
just
saludó,
state,
dijo
for
buenos
example,
días. Puede
Patricia,
decir, hola, soy Patricia, bueno,
can
yo
just
vengo de
mention
tal
also,
institución.
Patricia, I am from
Va
X institution. That's
enriquecer
also
todos
acceptable, and it
de
will
dónde provenimos.
enrich our
Bueno,
communications, and that way we
taller
know where
general
we're all from.
ha sido ya trabajado, venimos trabajándolo,
Well, we've been
preparando
working and preparing
oficina
these
para
consultations
en
with
Colombia,
the UNDP Colombia
del
office,
ambiente y
together
desarrollo
with the Ministry
sostenible.
of Environment and Sustainable
Muchísimas
Development.
gracias por ese apoyo técnico del
Thank you
ministerio
for your
y
technical
del Instituto
support.
Humboldt. Y
And
con
as well,
esto
and
tenemos
also
mucha
from,
suerte de
we
contar
received
con
technical
este
support from the
presentador
Humboldt
de
Institute,
alto nivel
and we
para el día de hoy.
are lucky enough to
Vamos
have
a
very
que
high-level speakers today.
entremos ya a detalle de nuestro taller. Me gustaría poder tomarnos una foto todos
So
juntos.
let's just
Imagínense
take
que estamos
a
en
picture.
un salón
Let's
y
think
si
that
alguien
we're
se
all
puede
in a room
prender su
together.
cámara
If you could just turn on your
para poder
cameras
tomar una
so that we can take
fotografía
a group
de
picture.
todos. Ahí está Daniela, qué gusto. Oscar, a todos,
There's
Fernando,
Daniela and Oscar.
Sonsi.
Great pleasure to see you.
A la cuenta de tres. Uno, dos,
So
tres.
1, 2, 3, say
Listo.
cheese.
Y creo que hay otra pantalla, hay muchas pantallas, ¿no?
Many
Mariano
screens.
creo que está tomando la fotografía. Necesitamos
Marianne
unos
is taking
minutos
the
más.
picture, so just give her a
Tenemos
few
grata
more
cantidad de
seconds.
participantes.
We're thrilled to have so many
Listo.
participants.
Entonces, muchísimas gracias. Con ello creo que ya podemos dar inicio
So we can now
al
begin
taller con las
the
palabras
workshop
de bienvenida.
with
Me confirman si ya contamos con la presencia de la
our
representante
welcome
del PNUD
speech.
que va a dar las palabras.
And
Zoraida, si pudieras hacerme
Zoraida
un gesto perfecto. Sí.
from UNDP will take the floor.
Todavía no. Entonces,
Or let me know, Zoraida. Okay, I'm just 1 second. Almost, almost.
no hay problema. Aquí tenemos la capacidad de adaptarnos rápidamente.
So don't worry, we will all quickly adapt if necessary. Okay. Now Zoraida Fajardo from UNDP Colombia. And if you could just send me a note when you're ready. And in the meantime, I'm going to explain some objectives of our workshop and today's session. Marian, if you could also help me by sharing the screen, that would help tremendously. Thank you. Or many of you are well aware, this project is the continuation of the Mapping for Nature, People and the Planet in Colombia that was implemented in 2020, 2021, and its objective was to identify essential life support areas in Colombia where actions of protection, restoration, management and restoration that are nature-based solutions can be used to help Colombia attain their national policy goals with regards to biodiversity, climate change, and sustainable development. What you can see in this slide is the final ELSA map in Colombia prepared in 2020. Then we will hear from Enrique Paniagua, who's an senior expert in the global UNDP development project, and he's going to speak about the ELSA project in Colombia. And our team has implemented this project in 13 countries in a very satisfactory manner. And Enrique will give you an update with regard to, or a presentation as to the work that we've done in those countries. So we used the ELSA methodology, and that's the next slide. We used that methodology to focus on the central region in Colombia that includes Bogota with regards to water security in the country.
diferentes
So
objetivos
today
de
we have the following objectives
consulta y los objetivos
for the
de
consultation process.
ustedes pueden ver aquí.
And
Para ello voy a solicitar también que mi
And
colega
for this, I'm
Liliana
going to also
comparta
ask Liliana to
agenda detallada
share the agenda, the detailed agenda that you received in your invitation, but it's best to have it on hand. So the
y
project
priorizar los
objectives
ámbitos
are here,
en los
identify and
que
prioritize
los
areas
responsables políticos
where
pueden adoptar medidas de
policymakers can take
para cumplir los
restoration measures
compromisos
to
nacionales
meet national
de
commitments on
biodiversidad
biodiversity
de
and land
suelo,
degradation.
revisar las prioridades estratégicas del país en
To review
materia
the
de
country's strategic
restauración
priorities in
y
the area of
definir los
restoration
conjuntos de datos mundiales y nacionales
and determine the
necesarios
required
para
global and national data sets,
y aplicar métodos de planificación sistemática de
and
la
apply
conservación para alcanzar
systematic
esta visión.
conservation planning methods to achieve this vision with scientific rigor. This is going to be disaggregated and presented throughout the workshop today and tomorrow.
Este taller
The
tiene
next slide.
dos partes,
So
entonces.
this workshop is going to be held in two parts. As you can see on the screen, the part one is today, part two tomorrow. This is a format that we've used in the past. We prefer not to condense this in a single session to be able to include the different activities that to take into account the fact that you have all busy work days. So next slide. We're also
Los dos días
going
que vamos
to
a tener juntos
see the
esta
work that we're going to cover in these sessions.
una introducción general al
The first
proyecto.
session includes a general introduction to the project. We'll see what your country has been doing with regard to restoration, with a special focus on understanding the ecological integrity map developed by the Humboldt Institute. And we'll focus on session two, the second part of today, the science behind our systematic conservation planning for restoration.
Pueden ver ahí,
The second
vamos a entender
part
cómo es que esta ciencia de la planificación sistemática de la
will
conservación
help us understand how systematic conservation planning can be used for creating the restoration map for Colombia. And this is based on open discussion among the different expert participants that are with us today and led by our scientific lead, Oscar Venter, who will join us tomorrow. So he will attempt to understand your national context and obtain the largest or obtain a vast amount of information to help him also plan the map. There is a microphone that's open. We're going to ask that it be closed. Then we will review the data that the different layer sets or data sets that identify the data sets with regard to restoration in Colombia. And we'll identify any gaps and try to make the data sets more robust. So we know that our participants have different levels of technical know-how with regards to systematic conservation planning. Some work with it on a daily basis, others do not. So the idea is to be able to speak in lay terms for everyone to understand the methodology behind the construction of this map of restoring hope. So we're going to, again, just remind you that this information is all, the presentations are in a Google Drive that we shared in our chat.
Como ven, nos vamos a enfocar en la
So
visión
going back
del proyecto para
to
Colombia.
today's
Vamos a tener
agenda, we're going to focus on the project for Colombia, we have individuals from the Ministry of Environment and Sustainable Development and the Forestry Department, and listen to how they're working with restoration and how this project will contribute to Colombia's restoration goals with the help of UNDP Colombia. We'll also make a list of your expectations, and then we'll address the heart of the project, which is the scientific side. Okay, so let's see if we have these speakers from the Vice Minister and the UNDP for introductory remarks. I'd like to thank the institutions that make this event possible. One is the country office of the UNDP in Colombia, and they have worked very closely with us in organizing and launching this project. Thank you. Part of the team is with us today, and the Ministry of the Environment Sustainable Development. They've helped fine-tune the view of this project, and they've given us crucial feedback, and they're also with us today. And we'd also like to thank technical support provided by the Humboldt Institute of Colombia and funding from the Secretariat on the Convention on Biological Diversity that makes this project possible. With further ado, I'm going to give Zoraida Fajardo the floor. She's from UNDP Colombia and will just share some introductory remarks. Thank you, Zoraida, for joining us. Hello, colleagues. Good morning. A special welcome from the UNDP Colombia office and Jimena Puyana, who had a slight mishap, so she'll be joining us. So thank you so much for your interest in joining us. It's a great pleasure to address topics dealing with restoration of ecosystems and being able to gather all of this information, which is so important for the country to be able to support our restoration goals on a national and global level as well. So your contribution, your knowledge will be of great use to the country and help us move forward in collectively constructing this strategy. And this, this map, map that we'll use for restoration, and that will be of great use to improve our connectivity, to improve conservation of ecosystems and services, and the well-being of the population that depends on these resources and ecosystem services. So thank you so much and welcome. Cassandra, we can move forward. And when our next speaker is connected, we'll give her the floor. So Enrique, I'm going to ask you that while you present, I may interrupt you, but that's because the Vice Minister takes this project so seriously that she will be with us from the airplane. So she's getting on the plane right now and we'll be able to connect in a few minutes. So perhaps we'll even hear the pilot. So pardon me if I just interrupt you during your presentation. So now we're going to hear from the vision of the Restoring Hope in Colombia project and how this focus can support you at a national level in attaining your restoration goals in the country. So to make this presentation, I'm going to give the floor to Enrique Paniagua. He's a senior policy expert for the Nature for Development Program at UNDP. At the end of his presentation, we're going to have a short
Si las tuvieran
Q&A
durante
session.
la sesión, pueden ir dejándolas en el chat. Yo voy a estar atenta y al final tenemos
So if
ese
you have questions, you can start jotting them down in the or typing them into the chat. And you can either raise your hands or send your questions for the in the chat, and we'll be answering them. Enrique, you have the floor. Thank you, Cassandra. It's a great pleasure to be here. I'm an expert in public policy and I work at UNDP. I want to give you a broad vision of this project. It's called Restoring Hope because we are building on the process of the ELSA maps, the maps for hope, as Cassandra said. So that's why we call this project Restoring Hope. Next slide, please. So we're beginning with perspectives that are very real, perhaps not so positive, but 40% of our land now is degraded. And this is what the fight against desertification has reported. 35% of the Amazon
Y estas, cuando hablamos de degradación,
suffering
estamos hablando de tierras de cultivo, de tierras
degradation.
secas, de humedales, de bosques, de praderas, estamos hablando de todo tipo de ecosistemas.
And cropland, dryland, we're speaking about many types of ecosystems. And 75% of our wetlands are
De
threatened.
esos
And
corales.
we've lost 14% of our coral reefs on a global level. 90% of fisheries are overexploited. We've surpassed 4 of the 7 planetary limits. We have 1 million species that are in danger of extinction, and 2 billion people depend on agriculture, forestry, and fishing to survive, and they're at risk given all of these nefarious situations that are occurring. And more than half of the world GDP depends on $44 billion dollars of worth of natural capital. So what does this mean? Next slide. This this shows the importance of nature. And this graph to the left just emphasizes the scenarios, various scenarios. If we continue with the path that we're heading on, or with the path that we have, our ecosystem services are going to experience a drop. More than half of the economy is going to be impacted. So if we continue on this path, our economy is going to topple. And we see how this path changes dramatically if we execute restoration actions, and if we add to that protection,
completamente cambiar el rumbo.
Protection of natural protection of nature, we're going to change this path and then pretty much restore our economy. And the Gupta report, which is a report that Great Britain's government uh, and Professor Doug Gupta from Cambridge University was asked to prepare this report, and he shows that if we continue on this path, we're going to destroy our economy based on the fact that we're destroying nature. So luckily, we have other options, other scenarios, and we know that each dollar invested in restoring degraded soil produces $7 to $30, for example. An economy, a regenerative economy produces annual yields of 125, $140 billion. And this represents 1.5 times of the GDP. So if we transition to this economy of restoration economy, we're going to increase growth of our GDP. And we have 2 very important things. During the decade of next. During our ecosystem or the United Nations appealed to work on 2030 on ecosystems by 2030. And this is an international appeal to be able to take this topic very seriously. And many projects are being prepared under this umbrella. And at the end of 2021, 115 countries committed to restoring 1 billion hectares of forest and croplands. And this is a surface that's larger than the United States and Chile. So you could see the breadth of this commitment. And this is how we were able to prepare this project, the project that we're here for today.
So, this project is born in December, was born December last year when the Biological Diversity Convention got close to us and said, okay, you as UNDP can help us streamline the restoration goals because we have this new biodiversity framework and this goal number 2 allows us to work on 30% of restoration of ecosystems. As we have worked for a long time in the mapping of nature, we say, of course, we have the experience of the ELSA project. So the goal is to help countries to optimize their goals through analysis of public policies and geospace information. We want to understand how countries are prioritizing restoration through public policies and what's the best information, geospatial information that they have in order to support that implementation. And we have also worked with the Convention to fight desertification, CNULD. So we are talking about the biodiversity framework and strategic objective or goal number 1 of the UN Convention against desertification. And in Colombia, we are also approaching that national restoration plan through our strategy. Yes, next, please. Now, the project we are developing in 5 pilot projects: Chile, Colombia, Ecuador, South Africa, and Kazakhstan. There we have a biome representation, which is very significant. And let me highlight that all of this in Colombia is where we go deeper. These workshops that are going to be during several days and consultations is a very special case in Colombia. We will have a participatory program for the restoration purposes. So in Colombia and in these countries, more efforts are being put into restoration programs. And this we are doing to support the national restoration strategy. And I think the ministry colleagues will be able to tell us how they are framing these country priorities. But the objective is to restore 753,783 hectares by the year 2026, if I'm not wrong. And they want to conduct these strategic alliances with different important stakeholders, and we want to help along those lines. And as I said before, this we are developing thanks to the essential areas to support life, or ELSA. And this is a process that we developed in Colombia, in 13 countries in general. And we started that in Costa Rica. And along that experience or program, we managed to create a consolidated methodology that we have applied and proven in different countries. So this is the methodology that we apply. In general, we want to create a national perspective through national priorities, better information existing in the country and globally. We want to analyze the regions with national experts. We always do it with experts, with the best experts available. We create the ELSA maps, weighing the different layers. We have co-created everything in order to produce public policy recommendations. And this is what we do through ELSA. And the results have been very good in Colombia. There have been two cases, the national case. So what are the indicative priority areas to protect, restore, and manage in a sustainable manner areas in the country? And we went even deeper. And we made a regional iteration in the central region in Colombia. So we started with UNTP in Colombia, and we managed to map the same. We lowered the scale, but in the central area, and we ran statistical analysis to see how the ELSA was at a departmental level. So we have information for Boyacá, for Huila, for Meta, for Tolima, etc. And we have resources to implement actions in the central region. We have different scenarios. This scenario is the most ambitious one, where we have more indicative areas, but there are other scenarios where priorities were reduced to other percentages. So we have a very rich analysis, everything collected in the water security or safety plan in Colombia. And we want to produce something similar, in this case, for restoration purposes. So we're going to concentrate on the restoration area for Colombia. This we are going to do at a national level. And to that end, we will need all the information gathered through ELSA. So we see the amount of information that we have nationally and internationally, and perhaps more information that is missing there. But that is mainly what we want to review with you, with national experts. And definitely there's plenty already done with ELSA, but we want to fine-tune that information with you during these workshops. So that's the presentation I had. Thank you very much for being here. And Cassandra, please, I give the floor back to you. Thank you, Enrique, for sharing the vision of the project with us. Now, if there are any questions, please write it on the chat or raise your hand. Otherwise, we can exchange views later. So thank you, Enrique. Now, let's move on to the next presentation. We will talk about the National Restoration Strategy 2022 and 26 in Colombia that is underway, and the ministry will explain about the National Restoration Workshop that will be held at the end of the month, that is consistent with this national effort in this field. So at the end of the presentation, there will be a round of questions as well, a Q&A. Natasha Garzón will be the one in charge of this presentation. Natasha will share her screen to make her presentation.
Sí. Ya estás, listo.
Natasha Garzón is from the Ministerio de Medio Ambiente y Desarrollo Sostenible. She will show her project that supports Colombia's priorities and efforts. I cannot share, she says. I cannot manage.
Sí, no te preocupes. Si logras proyectarlo.
Pues tengo un
If you
inconveniente.
manage to share your screen, it says the system tells me that I have to log off and on.
Ujú. Disculpen esa demora técnica, los gajes del oficio ahora en la virtualidad. Esperamos un minuto, un par de minutos, por favor. Mientras, los sigo invitando a que se vayan renombrando. Ahí pueden, en la misma lista de participantes, hay la opción de más y cambiar nombre. Tengo algunos nombres de celulares, modelos de celulares. Sería genial si pudieran colocar su nombre completo y la institución de la cual
Please,
nos
if you
acompañan.
could
Por ejemplo, de dónde
write your
somos,
full name and the institution
Lilia,
where you are coming from.
Andrés,
Eileen, Andrés,
Andrés, quizás estás conectado uno con el audio y otro con el video. Carlos Eduardo, gracias
Carlos
por
Eduardo.
desde el Sinti,
Thank
Carlos
you.
Mauricio del
Carlos
WWF
Mauricio from Colombia.
WCS Colombia también, Catalina, Listo.
BWSC from Colombia. Yes, thank you very much.
Dairo, por ejemplo, de qué institución nos acompañas?
If you let us know what institution.
Y así, una lista bastante extensa. No sé si Natalia ya se conectó. A ver, ya le estoy dando acceso. Listo, Natalia, mientras ya pruebas e ingresar, si pudieras quizá también compartir en el chat
Natasha, could you share on the chat or by email your presentation? Because the team can help you. No, it says that I cannot share. Okay. Give us 1 second.
No sé si lo tienes en algún link o alguna manera de enviarlo por correo de una vez a Liliana. Ella va a copiar ahorita su correo en el chat, cosa que
You can send it to Liliana by chat.
ir proyectándolo nosotros, ¿no? A ver, falta ponerlo en pantalla completa. Listo, lo logramos. Listo, Natalia, muchísimas gracias. Entonces, la palabra es tuya.
Pues bueno, después de
So, after solving the technological issues, I would like to thank you, the UNDP, and all the community supporting us from different institutions and entities that support the Sustainable Environmental Ministry. All these efforts of articulation of encounter are vital, essential, given the challenge ahead. We come from the Forest Department or Bureau, but also the contribution made by the different departments in order to build this national restoration strategy. So I will give you a description of the foundations of the strategy because it's so important not only to fulfill our country goals, but also to fulfill the comprehensive horizon for these efforts to be as effective as we want them to be. So very, very important. This has been built for a long time. The country has developed many public policies. One of the pioneers was the Natural Resources National Code, passed in 1974. At that time already, we saw how the environment had plenty to do with the welfare of our peoples. And biodiversity offsets, the strategy developed to accumulate 180 million trees. And the challenges are very important because the country itself is committed to carry out restoration efforts to enhance the quality of life of our peoples. And this is the objective that says that by the year 2030, we need to have 30% of ecosystem areas under some process of effective restoration in order to improve the ecosystems. And this is one of the 23 objectives, but there are some that are very, very, very important regarding the economies of biodiversity and how this protection and restoration goes hand in hand with being able to use in a sustainable manner the natural resources that we have. So, what is the strategy? This is a strategy that is trying to enhance restoration processes because those processes should have the objective of recovering the functionality of ecosystems, increase the resilience in the face of climate change, generate economies, and revitalize ecosystems. And these are the main elements. The components of the strategy are these, very much related to knowing where we should focus our efforts, what are the intervention areas, and also coordinate. That is to say, who is going to do the restoration, when, how, and who are the strategic allies. So we've had plenty of instruments and tools, but the resources are scarce. So one of the key elements of the strategy is the financial management that should be improved by strengthening social and community skills and competencies. That is a challenge that we will have to face, rethink, and design all together, and enhance territorial resilience and drive regional economies. We know that we have developed multiple initiatives, but at this time, it's been quite difficult to identify what is being done. And one of the bets of the strategy is that our objective by the year 2026 is over 753 new hectares. And we will change the focus. This is a process that should be conceived long term. There are values, there are estimates that we have of hectares year on year that have to be coordinated with the projects and the processes that are built, but also involve all the forest management systems and restoration itself and regenerative economy. This is not only the Environment Ministry that is involved. This has to be coordinated with Agriculture Ministry and territorial partners like the town halls, PPPs, NGOs, and there is a diversity of funding sources from royalties, tax on carbon emissions, that is the FONAM, cooperation, offsetting, and the productive reconversion. Although the objective, the goal is hectare denominated, there are some fundamental aspects contemplated by the ministry that are vital, and that is that restoration plays an essential role in the generation of economies, employment, community enterprises, and that has to be emphasized in time. So, the strategy led to building scenarios that allow us to identify where we should start, how, and how to create these territorial conceptions of channeling resources and perspectives. So we started from this scenario. The country has a model of ecological integrity. The natural base is understood based on the diversity of ecosystems, the comprehensiveness of coverage, and the ecosystem services. This map is our baseline, this bottom line, but we took the priorities developed for the Providencia San Andrés archipelago, pointing to the restoration priorities. So with these elements, we built this map, which is the baseline of the scenarios we are going to work on. First scenarios. These are the guidelines of our strategic plan. We have 15 territories that are fundamental to attain this territorial ordering. There are places where currently we have active deforestation cores, and those territories, strategic territories, add up to 34 million hectares, and we have 5.7 with very low ecological integrity, 13 with low, and 15 with average. These are the territories, island, the Cartagena Bay, the Catatumbo, and many others. The Pacific and the Atrato, the Atris Valley, Colombian mountains, the savanna, and the cores, the hubs that we see here for forestry development and biodiversity. But we have other areas that are very, very important, that are part of the national protected national areas, 23 hectares, and ecological integrity is not working very well there either. We have the reservation areas, and we see that we have high intervention areas and low and medium ecological integrity. And then we have the community territories, the farmers' reserves, and those are areas that are very important in social terms. However, we have 656,000 hectares with very low integration. We have the community councils of Afro-descendant communities, and it's necessary to intervene there to enhance the ecological support of these territories. And then Indian reservations, 7.5 million hectares. And you can see how those changes are taking place in what we call the natural support. Another analysis scenario, is that we have municipalities of the country with less than 10% in forests. And there are territories where it is necessary to have restoration actions implemented. 6.5 million hectares with very low ecological integration. And this is a very important focus point. Now, the waterways that are vulnerable and 5.1 million hectares have those limitations, natural limitations, very low ecological integration. Finally, and this is very, very important, we continue adding scenarios. These are the cores contemplated to carry out the comprehensive agrarian reform. It's 1.9 million hectares and 1.3 have lost their ecological integration. So land that is going to be delivered but have to be supported by a restoration process, multifunctional one. And our PDIT municipalities or districts where there is development linked to the Cologne Peace Accord and the replacement of illegal crops. So this is the ecological integrity of those territories and where we can make efforts with the other state agencies. So all this intervention will be possible if we manage to get into social agreements and forge alliances to say, okay, we are going to build this. This is the horizon of restoration and of sustainable development. And if we don't see like a government only strategy, it has to be an all party strategy and get everybody involved, communities, sectors, producers, farmers, the academia, in order to be able to see what are the priorities. We have to strengthen all competencies, create socio-economic incentives, conduct participatory monitoring, and guarantee financial sustainability in the medium and long terms, and consolidate companies and labor. So what are the steps to follow? The strategy cannot be only a document or maps. It has to allow us to build the country strategic projects. To that end, we can, from the ministry with the strategic allies, the UNDP, institutions, the academia, collaborators, we are trying to map projects, initiatives, strategic alliances and resources, trying to identify where we are and where we want to go. So we want to know what has already been done, if there are monitoring systems, if there are calculations by hectare, if you have a manual of propagation of a species, what are the deliverables already delivered? And we start from there because from the processes structured, we can strengthen what has been built during this time. So we have all these options. So what is the approach for those structural projects that are going to be part of the big restoration program? We have to build the vision, the elements to be taken into account. It's not the same to say that we have a restoration project for the Amazon than for the archipelago. So what are the components? Then the coordination, technical coordination, strategic coordination for restoration territorial programs. And there will be an on-site workshop on August the 29th that will allow us to build a roadmap for the programs, what macro programs we had to build from the government to strengthen skills, funding, local research, design, economic development, monitoring, and finally, the structuring of the macro projects that contain these visions, the portfolio of interventions, programs, and budgets.
So I would like to take advantage of this opportunity to be able to invite cooperation agencies and the participants that are here that this National Restoration Workshop that is called Together to Recover Lost Nature will be to design a work route that will help us to determine headway that has been made and projects that need to be addressed within the framework of the strategy. So we're going to continue with our internal analysis, but as I was telling you, we're mapping, we're in a preparatory stage, and this national workshop will hopefully help us attain more stakeholders for these bigger projects and develop a framework for priorities and programs and allow us to better structure and communicate the projects with key stakeholders. So by the first week of October, we hopefully will have a national program with framework projects with regards to intervention. So on behalf of the ministry, and we know that it's your belief also that recovering lost nature and generating economy for life is the biggest goal that we're facing right now. So we're going to now just take a minute to answer questions on the chat. The first one is from Onda Leon from National Patrimony. She says, where to look for this document in the future? Well, the document is still being revised. And it's not in a final draft phase. Now, it's not a longer document, but we're just fine-tuning this draft. So we want this document to not only reflect the Ministry of the Environment's perspective, but that of other ministries. So every day there's going to be changing information that's changing, and it's a document that's a live document. And we hope that by the end of the month, we will have our final version already approved. But we're still gathering information for that document. So just to mention that. And also information from this meeting as well will be included. Yes, of course. So Juan David's question is a bit longer, but it has to do with the actions that the government, what actions does the government plan to overcome barriers imposed from the official side to achieve not only restoration goals, but forestry development. And we're referring to issues such as certified seeds of native species, environmental impact studies for printing seeds, for importation of seeds and others. Okay, well, there are different strategies by the government or that come under the purview of the ministry with regard to overcoming forest deforestation. And it is this is one of the most enabling goals that we have. We need to readjust and even eliminate, well, I don't know if eliminate is the right word, but many of the policies that we have are hindrances to our achievements. So in the forestry department, we've tried to update policies to enable our national goals. And the same goes with ecological restoration. So the idea is to streamline our to streamline and not hinder and not and to be able to leverage on value chains to ensure sustainability. Thanks, Natasha. We have another question from Hector, and then we will go on to the next question, or the next speaker. So an important strategy from the District Environmental Secretariat is to deepen the strategies for consolidation of restoration data at a country level to avoid soil erosion, erosion, not only of information, but to reinforce implementations to advance sustainability. Okay, it's just a comment. Yes, we know that's a great challenge. Thank you for your comment, Hector. Okay, thanks, Natasha and Hector, and all of the speakers and individuals that asked questions. So we're moving along to Zoraida Fajardo, and she's from the UNDP Colombia. She's going to speak about how this project that convenes us here will respond to Colombia's restoration issues that have been presented now very well by Natasha. Zoraida? I think her microphone is muted. Yes, sorry about that. Okay, sorry about that. As Enrique and Natasha mentioned, the work that we do is truly important, and we're working on this in a manner that the global project, Restoring Hope, will help contribute to our national priorities for restoration. Next slide. And as we've also mentioned, based on the commitments on our global international commitments and the global framework on biodiversity, where goal 2 is to ensure that at least 30% of degraded freshwater or ecosystems are restored to ensure connectivity among them and concentrate on priority ecosystems. That's definitely important. And given the information we have as a country and our knowledge and the different global dynamics, we consider that we can make these contributions and be able to tie this with Colombia's international commitments based on the UN biodiversity commitments and to combat desertification, where the strategic framework for desertification is to improve conditions of impacted ecosystems, to fight against desertification and degradation of land, and to combat and promote sustainable land management and contribute to reversing land degradation. So these topics go hand in hand because land degradation occurs when there's a large degradation of coverage in ecosystems. And that obviously leads to these processes of degradation, and which are more complex to recover than desertification. So these are topics that the UN conventions require with regard to, these are the objectives based on UN conventions. So our global project seeks to attain this integration on different scales from a global to a national level, where international priorities will be attained based on regional and national processes to achieve these important goals that will have tremendous impact. As Natasha mentioned, the restoration goal covers more than 750,000 hectares. Restorations aren't something taken lightly or that take a short period of time. So we have an important endeavor ahead of us in monitoring and following up these restoration processes throughout the different periods that we establish. It could be more than 5 years, for example. So the Restore Hope project, Restoring Hope in Colombia, seeks to embrace national goals, international goals, and prevent degradation and achieve ecosystem restoration and land degradation neutrality. And of course, this also leads to facilitation of discussion among stakeholders and restoration for restoration priorities. And these types of meetings, as the one we're holding today, is key for facilitating dialogue. It's something we've been doing for some period of time now. And so the idea is to move forward through dialogue. We need to identify areas for these restoration scenarios through official geospatial data. So we have to find this data and include growing data that will encompass these analyses and allow us to achieve or to attain this map with the different scenarios. As Natasha mentioned, it includes ecological integrity. That includes 15 territories, different forestry and development nuclei. And we have to begin to process, to curate the information. And this project, Restoring Hope, with its scientists and experts, will work towards this end. And you are all important stakeholders for attaining the information that we need. And we do ask that you continue to accompany us in our meetings, join us, and help us facilitate this country view in order to address the areas that we're going to focus on for our restoration projects. And at the end, help us validate the results. And this is extremely important for the process that we're beginning on today, given these national level or scale scenarios. And then at the end, we would like to attain a consensus and establish a roadmap for implementation of our national restoration strategy. And the idea is to meet the national and global targets. And by August 29th, we will be able to pinpoint the different work that has been done. And the idea is not to reinvent the wheel. We're not starting at level 0. So we'll be sending you a link with a survey where you'll be able to look at the different initiatives or restoration initiatives. And it's very important to work together with our community organizations as well. The main objective of our restoration projects includes communities. So their input is definitely welcome. So with this, I end my presentation. Thank you. Thank you so much, Zoraida, for your presentation. Okay, so here's my, 1 second, I'm just looking at my participants list. Okay, thank you so much. We have various comments in the chat, people commenting on the excellent presentation by Natasha. We have Vilma's question. Looking at our national goals, are regional goals going to be established? Natasha, can you respond to Vilma in the chat? That would be wonderful. To be able to move right along with the presentations and today's agenda. So our next activity is going to be address the expectations or your expectations for this workshop. And in order to enable a large participation from all of you, we're going to use an application that we call Jamboard, and it's a virtual sticky note bulletin board. My colleague Marian is going to drop the Jamboard link into the chat. And I'm going to access to be able to explain how the Jamboard works. So the question is, what are your expectations for this consultation session? To the left, we see the different options in the left-hand side. You can add notes or click on the sticky note here. Now, if it's too complicated, or if you're on your cell phone, it's difficult to access, please just tell us what your expectations are for this workshop, and we will, with our backstage crew, place your comment in the Jamboard. Okay, I'm taking a look at a comment here. Not sure if it's a prior comment. Okay, Hector's says, according to country level prioritization, do projects bring independent funding or do they depend on national? No, these are questions for Natasha. Natasha, please help me respond to these questions within the chat while we move forward with our exercise. So we have one comment: to understand how areas have been prioritized or areas to be restored have been prioritized. When will the map be available to work on it? So what are your expectations? We have more than 120 participants, so we hope to have a chock full of post-its. What concrete information do you expect from the different organizations or institutions? So this is a question, and it has to do with perhaps information that's going to be provided, defining areas and areas of focus to develop the strategy that could serve as input to help define these areas for implementing restoration areas as part of our national strategy, mapping current restoration efforts in the country, that it serve as an opportunity to reach out to national stakeholders. Now we have other questions, Natasha, about the national strategy. Not sure if you're connected, Natasha. If you could help respond to that in the chat. Yes, I'm responding to them one by one. No problem. Thank you. Thank you. If you could do that in the open chat, that would be great because it might be a question that pertains to everyone. And it seems like you're sending the response in a private chat. So I think it's better to just respond in the general chat. Thank you. And we see more comments considering the hydrological cycles as a basis for planning and implementation of restoration within the framework of land territorial management tied to water. So here there's also a reference to the Montreal Summit for areas that are effectively available within for land use based on according to a baseline on different conveyed priorities. Okay, all these are interesting contributions. So this is also important for our project and this consultation project, as well as the different processes that the country is undertaking. And to be able to invite the local stakeholders to take part in restoration strategies. These are more articulation strategies with our national representatives. We're also copying these messages, taking note of them. Let's go to the second page now of the Jamboard. So you just click on next page to add your comments. Wow, so many new comments. Thank you. So adjusting to rhythm strategies with regards to degradation, the rhythm of degradation, we could say, of ecosystems, steps that each entity needs to adhere to and who's going to coordinate the strategy. So different aspects, relevant aspects are coming out here that are truly going to be helpful. Thank you. So we're going to take just a few more minutes to continue to receive your contributions. Remember, we have a second page. If you add these post-its, you can add the second page and you can access that. So if we could just go to the second page. Liliana, perhaps you can help migrate the first pages that are blocking other post-its and place them on the second page. That way I can read the post-its. Thank you. So we also have restoration, ecosystem restoration activities, especially on the marine, coastland, and main support, follow-up, calculations. For example, how about minimum trees per area need to be planted for restoration? Here says, what plans do you have to train professionals or experts? So training, strengthening skills, seek experts. More than 31 million hectares are destined to or owned by indigenous communities. So how do we take their priorities into account? So there's also a comment in the chat that has to do with the ministry's focus, and Natasha's responding to ministry queries. Okay, so just a few more to get to know, to achieve better territorial management, to organize our strategies, collective construction of a roadmap based on proven geospatial data. So that's the expectation that's been mentioned in one of the last post-its. Jessica Sandoval has a question in the chat. And Natasha is also going to contribute to responding to that. As a response to what Natasha presented with regards to Colombia's restoration strategies. So the Jamboard link is going to remain open in the event that you would like to look at that. We're going to have a 10-minute break and to be able to maybe get a cup of coffee. And I wish I were in Colombia to enjoy the wonderful Colombian coffee. And we'll be back in 10 minutes to join the next session, which is the scientific, well, we can say more profound aspect of our workshop. So thank you so much, and we'll be back in 10 minutes.
Listo, estamos ya de vuelta, el cronómetro no perdona.
We are back.
Todos ya volviendo
Thank you
a
very
la
much.
primera llamada. Nos reconectamos, segunda llamada.
Shall we reconnect?
Natasha, espero también sigas
Natasha,
conectada con nosotros.
I hope you are connected as well. Natasha, are you there?
Esperemos un segundo que se conecte Natasha también del Ministerio del Ambiente.
So Natasha will connect from the Environment Ministry to answer the questions and comments.
En el canal de preguntas y respuestas. Sí, Natasha nos
So
confirma.
Natasha, if you confirm that you are connected, I'm sure Natasha will connect shortly. And Beatriz Hernandez and Ana Maria, I'll put your questions in the chat so that Natasha can respond to all participants about how to contribute to the national restoration strategy, and some questions about reporting and verification mechanisms consulted. So I copied the questions in the chat so that we can all see them. Now, Natasha or the Vice Minister couldn't connect from the plane, but she sent a tweet that we can all read there that says that the national strategy, restoration strategy, is a great opportunity to restore hope, recover lost nature in order to improve resilience in territories and adapt better. It's a great mission where we all add. And thanks to UNDP in Colombia. There have been many reactions, and there are certain workshops that are announced, and it tags most of the institutions here today. Thank you very much for this. So the social media help a lot disseminate what we do. So thank you, Natasha. Natasha is there. Natasha is there with us. So the restoration strategy has raised plenty of curiosity, and that's very good. So now let's have a look at the presentation of the ecological integrity map developed by the Humboldt Institute. And this presentation will be followed by introduction to the science behind ELSA, called Systematic Conservation Planning. So we give the floor now to Paola Isaac, leader of restoration of the Center of Solution Based on Nature, who will explain us how Humboldt Institute developed the ecological integrity map. And then Dr. James Watson will talk about will give an introduction to systematic conservation planning. Dr. Watson is from Queensland University in Australia. He's professor of conservation science. And finally, we will listen to Mr. Scott Atkinson, our spatial ecologist, and Dig Zhang, spatial planning and biodiversity expert, that will guide us through some exercises to understand the systematic science between conservation. Dr. Penter tomorrow, the scientific leader of the project, will explain how we can integrate this map of ecological integration that will be explained to us by Paola, and we can integrate this to the analysis exercise for the development of better maps and priority restoration actions in Colombia. So, Paola from the Humboldt Institute will present the Humboldt project for the restoration strategy. Paola, please. Very good morning, and thank you for all this initiative. You know that we've been for a long time moving all these issues and seeing how we can move on. In terms of monitoring, we are a little bit weak, and we want to have more foundations. In the field, there is resistance to restore because people have this idea that restored areas are lost to production, and we want to celebrate the decision that we are closer working with agriculture and other activities that have transformed the territory in order to understand the restorations. So, as an institute, for more than 10 years, we've been working on restoration, especially in spatial issues, and we support the ministry in the construction of the restoration plan, but we also abide by international standards, understanding the needs that global agendas are putting in the territories, and understanding the interface between academia and decision making. That is a gap that we've been trying to narrow. So in that sense, I would like to understand that this spatial input can help us benefit more from restoration. And this is the content of the restoration program. There are some degradation scenarios that doesn't happen actually in territories, especially in Colombia, which is so heterogeneous. We have like a gradient of interventions. So there have been different discussions, and the restoration priorities are in highly degraded areas. What is the concept of degradation? Well, this is something that has led us to think that maps have an indication purpose, and every time we respond, we want to respond at more scaled areas. So can you please speak a little bit more slowly? Because interpreters are trying to interpret you. Yes. In that sense, we have to understand that that degradation leads to a biodiversity loss. And the restoration is planned to be able to address how we preserve the biodiversity over time. So we have to consider all the other benefits implied, but we had to try to limit the biodiversity loss and the ecosystemic services as established by the National Restoration Plan. We have to consider the levels of degradation and recover the biodiversity. So in this chart, you see how the production systems and those promoted currently through rehabilitation allow us to gain services and biodiversity. It's not only ecological restoration, but rehabilitation as well. And additionally, there are different components to address, not only vegetation, but also we have to understand the soil conditions, to understand if there are water components, how to address that, vegetation is something more visible, and the organisms that will be using that vegetation. Those processes are not very clear many times, and a social component, of course. So we are talking more about participatory restoration. So our approach is broader. We have those concepts from the biodiversity, that the spatial analysis is necessary to plan the territory, but not only to prioritize. Sometimes it's complicated to prioritize one sector or the other because all the country has needs. The Amazon has its own needs. The more degraded areas, such as the forest, has other needs. So we had to start to mix opportunities because if the degradation pace is faster than the restoration pace, it won't work. And it is important because I've seen many comments along these lines. What we want to approach for restoration, what's going to be our basis, and what are the other instruments or elements that generate other restoration opportunities. Of course, we talked a lot about styles, living styles, what is it that we can be recovered, indigenous populations, their use of the land, are more allied, are more in line with
internacionales, esa valoración económica de la reconversión productiva, pero también de la restauración. Ya también Natasha mencionaba cómo se vuelve una fuente de empleos y de bienestar, que es algo que también siempre es importante recalcar. Entonces, prefiero un poco más el término de oportunidades y en ese sentido, pues nos acogimos a una metodología que ha propuesto por el IDEAM con el Ministerio en el 2017, también para generar un espacio que fuera un poco más, digamos, cercano para los tomadores de decisiones. Entonces, porque tenemos una gran cantidad de insumos, el lista, digamos, es bastante grande, solo lo hemos evidenciado, pero organizar un poco como qué queremos abordar desde el inicio y ya más
we
adelante.
want to approach from the very beginning, and there is another input that comes to supplement the analysis. So the exercise is framed within what we propose as the main ecological structure, which is an element for decision making. This is an instrument, and that instrument has different principles. So in several exercises that we carried out, you have the shortcoming of information for decision making, and for some corporations that don't have installed capacity to have a person conducting spatial model analysis. So we compile information from three principles: diversity of ecosystems, more related to that structure and connectivity of the landscape, that is principle 2, and principle 3, ecosystemic services. That is along the same lines of the National Restoration Plan. So here we see a plan of ecological integrity or integrity of the landscape, because ecological integrity means many other processes developed. And this is a better way out to exemplify the use of the land. So the model
como más concreto y abordar pues los
could
tres
be more concrete and talk about these principles: diversity of ecosystems, the exercises that come from the Institute biomodels to understand the richness, endemic, threatened species. And this is brought from potential models that are more adjusted than the input that we use for the OEC. And it allows us to understand the accumulated biodiversity. And this is complemented with the location of the threatened ecosystems, such as the dry forest. with more priority. And it also calculates the remnants of ecosystems. Now, this is traditional metrics that are also familiar despite the fact that they are not so much used, but they are also an indication of the structure of the landscape, that is big areas that have a vegetable structure that is robust, that the coverage is natural. But when this is transformed, you lose the integrity, and it gives us the possibility of considering different restoration landscape. So we managed to do spatial exercises with the communities, what's their perception of the ecosystems, the data that are available. So in the first exercise, we tried to compile information or map some of those services. So there we include carbon systems and the control of erosion and flooding, riots, activities where the country is investing resources, and how the restoration plays a role there as a mechanism to mitigate those interventions. So these are the three principles that can be broken down. Diversity of ecosystems, we will have the information of wealth, endemic species, threatened species. That is very useful for cooperation purposes because we will have better access to consult these layers. The Institute also offers this to download information of species that are so charismatic and so well known. These are instruments, are elements that can be prioritized in the government agenda so that they can tell us where diversity has been lost. This is one of the goals of the restoration. There are forests that because of their size and their quality, they have lost those original conditions or big mammals. Although it's a natural area, it could have intervention processes that have transformed their original population. So that is fundamental to order the restoration efforts. The second component, the size, the form, the type of coverage, but not only that, the distance between patches regarding the fragmentation calculation, because it's the same. It's not the same to have small patches close to each other or one big patch. The distance is fundamental for the dissemination of species. And then the vegetation structure developed by NASA. It is interesting to see that there is an element indicating where vegetation has been lost and where it has been gained. So it's more dynamic, not so static. In this case, using the official cartography and mapping tools. And the third principle, this was to talk about the structure and why this is important, and how it moves ahead the secondary vegetation, for instance, which is such an important element in those areas where there is coverage recovery, carbon capture, etc. And the third component, services. Carbon, that is the most famous. Additionally, okay, it's an indicator of health of ecosystems. It allows me to see how vegetation is lost and it starts to change. It's an indicator of diseases in vegetation. So not only regarding the quantity of biomass, but how it is, I mean, the status, in this case, forests. Now, for the hydric supply, this is Colombia has quite a big supply, but when the ecosystem is degraded, it can affect the water conditions. So we want to understand where the water supply is, because it is something that people want to preserve, but how those natural areas, I mean, regulate that supply. And there we consider the gradients, permeability, the slides, etc. And the other two components, erosion and floods. In that sense, we use the MBI indexes, NTVI indexes. We use also the IDEAM climate seasons available. And with the regulation, we use the corresponding maps to get to know the permeability of the land, to see where coverage is maintained, so as to have that control, natural control of streams, and where that is lost. Those two components, control of erosion and flooding, also brings an impact to bear on risk management, but also with the land, the water tables. So it's good to plan and to see that in the flooded areas there should be a differentiated management of the land and of the ecosystem. And this we did nationally, but we run it in different scenarios. So you've seen that in Natasha's presentation. You resort to different additional input to show what's happening in the territories. There is integrity, and it allows us to have highly reserved areas working as those hubs or cores of conservation or preservation with the best quality available, and then the gradient to propose what the National Restoration Plan requires that we do more work for the coverage not to be so degraded. So this is an example. There are different combinations. With the map, you can run the corridors. In those corridors, which proposals can be presented. We also resorted to, or we try to understand how the use of the land impacts our efforts in terms of decision making, in order to get an idea of the most appropriate use to promote the activities and the actions that will entail less resources on land that is not productive at all. So here you see different decision-making patterns. We have used different tools, the land dispute or conflict parameter we also used. Sometimes actions have to be different. The agricultural frontier also we took into account. So we started to break down the applications. This is an exercise for Bogota. These are the potential connectivity routes, and it gives that integration and a potential degradation ecosystem. You see areas in yellow, in green, more affected, less affected, and there are restoration actions for each type of degradation. So when we are sending that message of planning more oriented to understanding restoration goals and designing a roadmap that is more planned and taking into account the landscape and the dynamics of the territory. Next.
We also prepared exercises. This is for Nariño, the Department of Nariño, and some input that we could see. And it includes not only ecological restoration, but other use of the soil. But here we see other types of ecosystems. We see the plains lands that these attributions aren't always present. We also have grazeland, and the idea is to update our input or the data for this area that we called Mojana, which is a sort of wetlands, or this area is another area that we want to include. And then we want to be able to understand how connectivity works with expansion, with water supply. And in the past, we've ignored these areas and their devastating effects that Colombians are aware of in this area of La Mojana. And we also are looking at the Amazon ecosystems, we have addressed restoration costs, and the idea is for productive reconversion to also be addressed. And this is an entryway to be able to conduct another type of cattle raising, livestock production that will benefit our environment. So these are all regenerative principles that we've been working on for some time now, and that we hope will reduce degradation. The last one has to do with promotion of biodiversity for food supply, and we want to be able to trade native Colombian commodities or traditional commodities. And then we've been trying to quantify these types of spatial inputs. We've been addressing connectivity along the coastline and how to leverage on that. So at the end, when we have areas that we're able to restore, to be able to address this through different types of arrangements in rural areas, for example, landscape management. So all of these different types of tools to be able to help us with ecotourism, for example, regenerative livestock production, diversifying use of soil. And this is also something that we think is more attractive to communities and will allow us to be able to actually use the maps for this purpose, especially in the San Andres and Providencia area. So the idea is to be able to track areas, farms that are already conducting these types of activities, regenerative livestock production, etc., and multiply these efforts. So thank you so much for listening. Okay, thank you, Paola. We already have reactions to your presentation, some questions in the chat. I'm just going to read a few of them. Paola Fair says from Imbermad, it says, these three cross-cutting items, ecosystems, integrity of ecosystems, ecosystem diversity, ecosystem integrity, and services, they make up the integrity of the landscape, and they consider do they consider baseline information of projects that have already been implemented? And yes, they have been. The idea is to be able to also marry what we have in the field or the results from the field and confirm that with the maps. So sometimes we find that what happens in the field is different from what happens in theory. So we've considered how inputs reflect the reality of the soil or of what's happening out in the field. So it does take it into account. Remember that our country conditions are different given the Amazon, the Caribbean. So the idea is to pinpoint an area and consider baseline activities that have been conducted. So they do. Okay. Also, this addresses what many people are asking about the importance of striking a balance with the work that is done, theory versus field work. Herman is asking, he's saying that looking at the input layers, and it seems that the integrity of forest ecosystems are based on fragmentation metrics. Now, how is their adjustment, how is this being applied for non-forest systems such as savannas? Well, for example, ecosystem services prioritizes water supply. So savannas will play an important role here because there are areas of flood areas, but these are fragmentation metrics. And yes, savannas are included in the weighting as if it were a forest. So we try to emphasize this with the input available. So nationally determined contributions, for example. And palm oil, for example, that may seem like forests, broad coverage of land cover. So we're considering other types of land coverage, and your makes sense. Paramos are different than a rainforest. So we have to determine where the carbon is. And it's an ecosystem that needs to apply all sorts of restoration strategies. And we know that degradation, transformation is required. So this is an issue we have to work on. Okay. So there are going to be more questions in the chat for you, or there are more questions in the chat for you. If you could go by one by one and address them, since we have to continue with the presentation. We're now going to move on and hear James Watson. He's going to give us a brief presentation on systematic conservation planning, and it's the science behind our project. He is currently on the other hand, the other side of the world in Australia. So we have a wonderful video he sent, and Marian's going to play this video. So let's begin with his presentation.
G'day. My name's James. I'm a professor of conservation science at the University of Queensland. And today I'm going to talk about conservation planning and how it relates to essential life areas that has been led by the United Nations Development Programme and other organisations around the world. So what are conservation decisions? Well, I think we've got to put it in context.
Dame un minuto para parar la interpretación de mi lado.
Perfecto, esperamos un minuto entonces. De mi lado se escuchaba muy bien.
Okay, 1 second. We're just going to begin the presentation one more time.
Vamos a esperar, sí.
Cassandra, ¿estabas escuchando el inglés y el español al mismo tiempo o no?
No, sí estaba escuchando solamente al español, sí.
Ok, súper bien, gracias. De mi lado, yo estoy oyendo ambos.
When we go outside, do we take our umbrella? We make decisions on a Friday night. Do we go to this party or that party? These are decisions that are real life, and we always do those decisions. So we shouldn't be scared of them. In conservation, for the last 50 to 100 years, we've often walked away from going through these difficult decisions about really translating them.
Perdón, Marión, si lo podemos
Makes
detener,
sense.
estamos ahora
And we
sí
should do it
escuchando a
more
ambos.
transparently and more honestly. And they simply equate to these questions: why, what,
Y
where.
podemos detener la grabación porque estamos escuchando a ambos y es muy difícil entender la interpretación. Ujú.
Sí, pero no sé cómo, sí, te estamos escuchando, pero es muy difícil, no sé cómo hacer detener la presentación por los interpretados, ¿no? Interpretadores y no tener, así que no sé, creo que sí.
Exacto.
Ok, vamos a entender de nuevo sí.
Ujú.
Nations Development Program Team and other great organisations around the
Mejor.
world. So what are conservation decisions? Well, I think we've got to put it in the context of the real world. We make decisions every day. We make decisions, when we go outside. Do we take our umbrella? We make decisions on a Friday night. Do we go to this party or that party? These are decisions that are real life, and we always are going through those decisions. So we shouldn't be scared of them. And in conservation, over the last 50 to 100 years, we've often walked away from going through these difficult decisions about really translating them into a process that actually makes sense. And we should do it more transparently and more honestly. And they simply equate to these questions: why, what, where, when, how, and who. If you start breaking it down into that, you can start actually working through a very simplistic but very transparent process to get to an outcome that works for biodiversity, for ecosystem services, and for the people involved at the landscapes and seascapes where conservation happens. Basically, conservation planning and conservation decision making is about how should we decide on conservation priorities. I think we all know horror stories in the past that we've actually focused on special animals or places that are really suitable for some parts of biodiversity or some parts of value to humanity that has discounted other places. We really spent a lot of time focusing on some things, but that has meant that other things have missed out. In my country of Australia, we've spent a lot of time protecting some very charismatic species, such as the koala, but many, many other endangered species have simply missed out on any kind of conservation attention as a consequence. And I'm sure in the nation that you sit in right now, these problems arise as well. Now, what conservation planning does is actually put all biodiversity on the table and all ecosystem services on the table in a transparent way. So you can work through all levels of biodiversity ecosystem processes, the costs and threatening processes that happen, their condition, and work out what is the priority for that nation or for the people in the landscape, or even globally, to think through what comes first and what comes second when you think about conservation. Now, fundamentally, until recently, what has limited conservation planning is good data. We've really struggled to get good data on where biodiversity and other ecosystem services have been located and what threatens these elements of biodiversity and ecosystem services. It's been a really big gap, and it's been highlighted by many studies around the world. And if you haven't got good data, you can't have good plans, regardless of the principles adopted. But the beautiful thing recently there's been this fantastic data revolution over the last 5 years. The big data revolution that everyone's getting excited by is actually real, and it's actually changing the way we think about conservation. So to make good conservation decisions, we need good spatial data, and that good spatial data is becoming increasingly available. So the excuse that we don't have the data at our fingertips is actually not actually really valid much anymore. So with good principles and good data, we can actually identify the locations and the intensities of actions that we need to do to overcome the threats to save biodiversity and ecosystems. Now, at a fundamental level, there are really only 4 principles you need to follow to get a good conservation plan going. You need to make sure it's connected, adequate, representative, and efficient. That's called the CARE principles, C-A-R-E. So if you get these 4 principles right, you will get a good plan every time. And it means basically, if you get these 4 principles right, the whole is always more than the sum of its parts. Connected is very simple. It means that from a species or an ecosystem or a process perspective, things can actually be connected and populations can support each other. So if it's not connected, these processes are broken, the system will fall apart. From an adequate point of view, you must make sure you've got enough of anything that you value to ensure that it can persist in the future. If you don't have enough of it, it won't persist. Representative means that you make sure you get everything you want in the system. It's like a recipe book. You can have a perfect cake, but if you don't get all the right ingredients in that cake, it's always going to taste bad. So you've got to have a representative system. You've got to make sure that all the pieces of the cake are actually there, the ingredients, so you can cook it at the right temperature and get the cake to the quality that you want. So you need a representative system and all those ingredients that you want in that conservation system to be there. So you want species, habitat, and ecosystem processes. And efficient, well, you need to make sure you get it at a minimal cost. My personal opinion is we often over worry about budgets. I think conservation, we really try and we should always ask for more. We always actually try and scrape by for too little. But the bottom line is, like with all walks in life, the less it costs, the better, the more chance of success. So an efficient system is always a better system. So they're the CAR principles that we should always follow when we're thinking about planning. And as you do your workshops and as you do your planning in everyday life, if you follow the CARE principles in conservation, you're always going to succeed, I think. So that's the basic lecture that I wanted to give, and I wanted to say thank you for your listening, and it's been really rewarding thinking through this. My email address is james.watson@uq.edu.au. Happy to take questions at any time, and I look forward to hearing how you go. Thank you.
Muchísimas gracias a la distancia a James Watson. Si tuvieran alguna pregunta, comentario, lo pueden dejar
So
en el
we'd like
chat.
to thank James Watson for his presentation, and we will get your questions to you on the other side of the ocean. For the next session, we have presenters that are English speakers, so definitely activate your interpretation in the lower part of your screen next to the microphone or the video. There's an option where you click on the globe and you select the Spanish. If you didn't hear it clearly, you will be able to get this video and hear it and the rest of the materials in the drive that we have shared with you. So we're now going to Scott Atkinson's presentation and Dee Zhang's, and it's about systematic conservation planning, and it allows us to understand this science a bit better.
Hi again, everybody. Thanks for joining again today. Right now, we're going to talk a little bit more again about systematic conservation planning. Some of you may have seen these slides previously if you were involved in the ELSA project, but we're going to go through a simplified version of them again today, just to reiterate some of the main points of systematic conservation planning. So the main point of systematic conservation planning is using tools to help us identify and prioritize the best places for action. You'll notice that I'm adding the word taking inside parentheses here in front of the word action, because really it's all about implementing an action. It's about taking an action, not just identifying the places for an action. And I think that's somewhat of a semantic point, but I think it's an important point to make. Quite often we think about priority places for species conservation, or we think about priority areas for habitat richness. We have lots of global maps showing global priorities of things, but those themselves aren't actually telling us the action we need to be taking in those locations. Particularly when we think about restoration, we're talking about doing something on the ground. So we're not just talking about finding priorities for restoration. We're talking about priority for particular actions we need to take. Again, I think it's a very semantic point, but I think it's an important point for us to think about and remember as we go forward with this. And further, what does the word best even mean in this instance? So we might be thinking about the most optimal solution to a systematic conservation planning solution. That might be the solution that has the lowest overall cost. It might be the solution that has the smallest area allocated to it. And so all these might be optimal, but they may not be the best. So the best solution is probably going to be the solution that's most likely to be able to be implemented and the most likely to have success in its implementation. So these are all further factors that play into it. So simply taking the cheapest, the smallest area is not always going to be the best solution to a systematic conservation planning scenario. Ultimately, this is all founded upon our values. As community, as people, as governments, we need to identify what it is that's important to us. Typically, if we're thinking about conservation, we might be thinking about environmental things that are important to us, species of interest or habitats of interest, or ecosystem services, perhaps clean water. These are all things that are very important to us on very different levels. We might be thinking about resources, access to resources. And this can be things like clean water supply, but equally it could probably be access to things that people use, firewood, for example, or fisheries, or even taken to a further extent, resources that we use in our industrialized societies, so access to mining, coal, for example, or other resources that we use to power our economies. And also, we have to consider cultural heritage. There are some places that have values that go beyond our general understanding of economic values that are much harder to put a value on in terms of dollars and cents or pesos. Things that just inherently, culturally, are incredibly vitally important to us. And how do we account for all these things in our decision-making process? Because ultimately, the whole point of all of this is to make a decision and to take action on that decision. And this comes down again to identifying what our targets are. What are the things that constrain us? Are they financial constraints? Are they political constraints? Are they social constraints? As well as thinking about what data we have that can help identify these targets, can guide this process, and what the constraints are in that data. See on the map on the right, this is a product from the European Commission Joint Research Council called the Atlas on Desertification. It's a consensus product, which means that it's basically a layer looking at the agreement between multiple input data layers that would indicate desertification processes occurring in an area. And instead of just saying that this is occurring, this is saying there's multiple lines of evidence indicating that this might be occurring. So in the map on the right, these areas in the brighter colors, those are areas where there's more lines of evidence converging to indicate that some process that could lead to desertification is occurring in Colombia. Equally, those darker areas would indicate a lower likelihood of desertification occurring. And this data set is globally available at about a 1 kilometer resolution. So, is that a scale at which we can make these decisions? That's not really for us to answer right now. That's something for us to discuss and talk about. But that resolution of the data is also equally an important constraint on our decision-making process. Now we're going to talk a little bit about some jargon. Some of you will have seen these before if you'd seen these suite of slides in the ELSA project and the ELSA workshops. The first term that I just want to reintroduce again is the term target. And here we're talking about a real number that we set as a target for restoring an area of degraded habitat. We're talking about a real number, not just some hypothetical. We want an actual figure, 10%, 11%, 30%, 28% of degraded areas in the country. We need something that we can identify as a real target to feed into these optimization models. Next is the idea of a planning unit. So these are units of land, or they can be sea, on which actions are taken. So these can be parcels of land, these can be watersheds, these can be coral reefs, they can be other user-defined grids or polygons of any kind. Thirdly, we have the boundary penalty factor, BPF. Sometimes this is called the boundary length modifier, as you'll see in the next few slides after this. And this is simply a modifier to affects the compactness of a particular solution. So if we set this at 0, that means that the solution, the mathematical solution, will make no efforts to group selected planning units together. If we set this to a very high number, that means the mathematical solution will try as hard as it can to clump them together more and more. So the higher the number is, the more clumped the solution will be. And this might be more representative of what we see in protected areas, for example, where we tend to have a smaller number of larger protected areas, simply because that's typically a little bit easier to manage. And finally, and this is something that we're not really going to talk too much about in the rest of this process here today, but I wanted to mention the species penalty factor, or you can think of it as a feature penalty factor. And this is simply a penalty that goes into the scoring of a systematic conservation planning solution when a particular target for a feature is not met in the solution. And I mention that here simply because it will show up in the next few slides as we go over a short example. So the basic scoring scenario of any systematic conservation planning solution accounts for the cost of the planning units. So that could be an area cost, it could be a financial cost, it could be an opportunity cost, plus the penalty applied from the boundary penalty factor or the boundary length modifier, plus any penalties incurred for not meeting particular targets, so the species penalty factors. Here's hopefully an easy to understand example of what we mean by this and how this will work. For example, here we have 9 planning units. They're in a nice little square, equally sized, and within those planning units we have 3 species. We have a fish, a butterfly, and a little mouse rodent type of thing. And you can see on the right, up in the planning units, their extent of these, the range of these species throughout this planning unit system. So we're going to assume that each planning unit has the same cost. We have a boundary length modifier value of 1.5, and there's a penalty applied to any solution for any species not meeting its target of 10. So what does this look like then in implementation? Well, there's 2 scenarios provided to us here, and measuring their overall score. In the first scenario, you can see on the top left, we have 4 planning units selected. We have 3 in the top left and 1 in the bottom right, separated. If you count up the length of those boundaries and multiply it by the boundary length modifier and add on the species penalty factor, because if you remember from the previous slide, we do not account for the range of that particular fish species, so it falls outside the reserve design. If we add those all up, we get a total score of 32. In the bottom solution, we again have selected 4 planning units, but this time they're all clumped together to the bottom right of our planning unit matrix. If you count up the length of those boundaries and multiply them by the penalty factor and add the species penalty factor, of which there is none, because in this instance, all the species have some of their range falling within this reserve design. If you count those all up, we have a total score of that scenario of 16. Similar to golf, the lower the score is a winner, essentially. So in this case, the bottom scenario would be the most efficient solution we would go for. So typically we apply systematic conservation planning methods to thinking along the lines of protecting species or habitats or ecosystem services. We typically think about which areas or which species need to have some sort of protection put in place, either in the form of a formal protected area or some other area-based conservation efforts. But how do we want to apply this then to restoration? And I want to leave this as a bit of an open question to all of you, just to think about the differences and the similarities that might apply between these two approaches and these two approaches to implementing a systematic conservation planning approach for protection only, for environmental conservation only, versus applying this to restoration. I'm not going to have an answer to this because I think it's something that we should talk about further, but I just want to put that question out there. So that's it for me for now. If you do have any comments or questions, please feel free to bring them up now. Or you can also email me at scott.atkinson@undp.org. Thanks again for listening and good luck with the rest of the workshop.
Agradecemos a Scott hasta Australia, quien después va a poder acceder a las grabaciones y el documento con preguntas y respuestas que vamos a compilar y subir
So
también.
we're going to ask Scott, we're going to thank Scott for that. Thank you so much.
Pero no solamente pueden compartir.
Not only share questions for him to respond, but we have Oscar Benter, the scientific leader of the project, who will be able to answer the questions that you might have about the science of planning, systematic conservation planning. We have seen in the chat a question about the National Strategy of Restoration that Natasha will try to respond. And I don't know if you have any further questions about this recent presentation.
Benter, el líder científico del proyecto, se encuentra
Because Oscar Benter is connected. You can ask the question in the chat or raise your hand, and we will open the mic. Do you want me to answer this question? In the chat. It has to do with national strategy. The rest can ask, raise your hands, and we will open the mic about Scott's presentation. If you have questions about Scott's presentation, please go ahead. We will all have the presentations and videos in the Drive folder and the document with questions and answers and comments and reactions during the session. It seems there are no questions or comments about Scott's presentation, so tomorrow there will be a space with Oscar Venter, the scientific leader of the project, to see how we apply this science for the production of these maps for restoration priority purposes for Colombia. So thank you very much for your participation in this first day of consultation of the project Restoring Hope in Colombia. We meet tomorrow at 9 again, Colombian time, to understand together how the systematic conservation planning can help us create this restoration priority map for Colombia. There is a question now. Natasha, this question is related to how we relate the National Conservation Plan to other efforts. Natasha, you will address that later, right? So tomorrow we will be able to go through missing information. The Humboldt Institute presented plenty of material today, and that will serve us as feedback for tomorrow and food for thought. So thank you for being here. It's been a pleasure. to see you and see you tomorrow. Thank you very much.
Gracias,
Que
gracias.
tengan un buen día.
Muchas
Gracias.
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 Hasta luego todos y gracias.
Gracias, muchas gracias.
Gracias a todos.
Hasta luego.
Gracias.
Gracias.
Muchas gracias, hasta luego.
Gracias. Hasta luego, gracias.
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 Hasta luego, muchas gracias.
Gracias igualmente. Nos vemos mañana. Hasta mañana.
Buen día. Hasta luego.
Gracias, Natasha. Gracias. Nos vemos
Natasha,
mañana.
gracias.
Gracias. Gracias,
Muchas
Edna.
gracias
Muchas
a
gracias.
ustedes.
Hasta mañana. Gracias. Muchas gracias, Parque, que ha participado bastante. A Diego también, gracias. Johan, muchas gracias por su participación. Nos vemos mañana. Corpo Javio presente. Así es, gracias, José. Muchas gracias. Gracias, Claudia, por tu disposición. Muchas gracias. Nos vemos mañana. Muchas gracias. Sí, Daniela, Liliana, no cierres todavía, tengo una pregunta de Daniela. Sí, Daniela.
Hola, Cassandra y Liliana, ¿cómo están? Muy chévere. Primero, muy chévere, gracias.
Gracias.
Quería saber si podemos tener como la lista de los participantes, porque nos interesa mucho cómo poder guardar los correos o los nombres de las personas de las autoridades ambientales, como por ejemplo Carzuque, Corpo Guavio,
Sí,
Cortolimas, no sé, bueno.
sí, por supuesto. Sí. Una vez que ya podamos cerrar la sesión,
Listo,
vamos a poder trabajar en la estadística y Liliana va a enviarles a ustedes, el equipo núcleo de coordinación del evento, toda la información. Pierde cuidado, ahí tenemos los contactos de correo con los que se han registrado y toda la información.
Súper, muchas gracias.
Listo, ¿no? A ti.
Daniela, y nos ayudan con la presentación del ministerio para poderlo poner en el Drive. Así
Claro que sí,
veamos.
claro que sí. Te la comparto.
Seguimos todavía en la sesión, si podemos hacer estas coordinaciones después, porque todavía tengo alrededor de 60 participantes conectados. Si Liliana pudiera ya cerrar la sesión, por favor. Muchas gracias
¿Cómo
a
lo hago?
todas, todos. Sí, tienes un botón a tu derecha rojo que dice
Ah.
salir o abandonar o cerrar la reunión para
Ok,
todos.
ya para todos se cierra,
Yo no
listo.
puedo. Sí.
Listo.
Gracias, hasta
Muchas
luego.
gracias para todos.
Chao,
Bien.
chao.